Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders, where we bring in leaders from various fields of expertise and get their thoughts and insights around recent developments, things that are happening in the past, present, and near future. Today, we've got Barry Conchie and Sarah Dalton from Conchie Associates talking about leadership and leadership excellence specifically and how that landscape is changing. Thank you so much for joining us, guys.
Great to be here, Chris.
Of course. Tell us a little bit about what you guys do and who you guys work with.
Well, my background is about 45 years long. I spent a career in the UK where I was an expert educator and ended up joining an American company, Gallup. Worked in London for 2 years for Gallup and then came over to the US around the year 2000 and led their leadership development practice, research and development practice until I left and set up my own company, Conchie Associates, in 2013. I've been fascinated with the people characteristics of leadership probably my entire career. We've all worked for great leaders, I hope. We've certainly probably all worked with bad leaders. I know I have. And just that variance alone is intriguing. You know, what are the conditions and circumstances which bring that about? How do people end up in leadership roles who clearly shouldn't? So those kinds of questions have been a big part of my career. You know, my interest in psychology, statistics, and neuroscience took me down the research selection path. So I became particularly interested in how we predict when we make selections. So every time you go for a job, Chris, somebody's assessing you, right? And they're trying to figure out whether you're a fit, whether you've got the right kind of characteristics. Maybe you got a smiley face, you got the right attitude, all the things that I'm deficient in probably. And then they make a determination that you're better than somebody else or somebody else is better than you. That fascinates me. So I made it my career to study it. I made it my career to develop expertise in it, and I've built a company with that in mind. Company's been around now for 11 years, nearly 12. Sarah's been with me for over 8. And between the two of us, we work with some pretty big clients, big companies around the world. And, you know, you mentioned earlier about a great client for us. A great client is an organization that recognizes it's nowhere near learned enough about leadership, but is extremely curious about the scientific nature of predicting human attitudes, behavior, and performance. So anybody who's intrigued in those areas and is very, very diligent in wanting to get decisions around who to promote, who to hire, maybe even who to fire, then they're good partners for us.
Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, you had asked the question about my own background, and I think I've always gravitated to younger companies that had a vision for what they wanted to do, but no existing process for how to do it. And that's really how Barry and I got connected. And now I am in charge of making sure that the selection tools we build can scale across an entire organization. Right? So we build assessments that make predictions about a person's effectiveness in a role. But there's a big training and education gap that we need to fill when we're partnering with companies, because we've got to figure out what their current selection process looks like, how we fit into that, but also how we influence people's thinking about who they hire and ultimately who they shouldn't hire.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack in this conversation, right? Because I think there's a lot of taking what has naturally been the intangibles in personality traits or individual performance, and then how do you then quantify a lot of these things, which it seems like you guys have figured out some kind of assessment plan to do so. And I'm sure there's a lot that you've uncovered in that process. Also, I think about like when we're talking about leadership and just having like the debates yesterday for our next president in the US, like I don't know. I mean, it makes me a little concerned if that's like the definition for younger generations looking at leadership a little bit. And I'm curious if there's any thoughts or takes on that, not necessarily, you know, related to a specific party, but just on how these individuals have gotten to a place of this kind of leadership, right? So before we kind of get into that, let's just talk about how you like, and maybe Barry, this is more so on you in terms of how do you start quantifying people's performance based on, I don't know if it's the psychological, the personality types. You know, are there other like tools out there already that people should be using or thinking about? Think of like Enneagrams and things like that, or is that just like completely different?
Yeah,
Than
sorry, Chris. I actually nearly swallowed my tongue when you mentioned the Enneagrams, but let me separate out what you're asking into three areas.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the criteria of performance, because if we don't find leaders who can deliver great performance, then we're really in the wrong game. So let's start by a definition of performance. We established three criteria. For number one, in order for us to study you, you need to be a number one performer in your company in three independent measures that are of global significance to the company. So global within the company. In other words, these are measures that touch all parts of the company. So they're obviously going to be revenue-based, they could be budget-based, they could be innovation-based, depending on the nature of your organization. So top in three independent measures. That's the first criteria. Second criteria, we have an active dislike of leaders who bully people to perform. Yep. So we want to include an engagement metric, because an engagement metric is going to tell me whether those results have been achieved the right way. Have you treated people well? Do people feel good under your leadership? And we only use a credible global engagement metric. So one like Gallup has got a great global metric. And we want to see leaders who treat people well, and we're going to see a proxy for that in high engagement scores. Third criteria is do the first two for 3 years running. Now, why? Well, because I think any leader can do it 1 year. And we see lots of these leaders, but then they fall off the next year. We wanted people who could sustain those kinds of outcomes over 3 consecutive years. That gave us a reasonable proxy for cutting through different business cycles. So, the typical sawtooth, whether you're looking at the Dow Jones or whether you're looking at any company's performance, up, down, up, down, up, down. We wanted leaders who delivered year in and year out. We thought 3 years was enough. And I've got to tell you, it was one heck of a task finding 100 people to study for 3 years. So those are the performance elements. Next element, how did they do it? Right? Because they did it and nearly everybody else didn't. And so that's where we started to look at their psychological profiles and their characteristics. And our assessments are a little bit different than standard personality assessments. Our assessments are talent assessments, natural traits and dispositions that are very consistent in a person over time. Now, they're not dissimilar from personality in that sense, because, if you've got kids, you've noticed that they had a personality from when they were born, and it hasn't probably changed that much by the time they got to 16. Well, talents are very similar, but they're work-related. So these are capabilities that can be productively applied at work. And then the third element is being able to assess for those characteristics. So we set the performance outcomes and the standard for research. We find the talents that predict for success in a role based on studying these fantastic performers. And then we build questions in an assessment that test for those characteristics. We've now got to the point, Chris, where we've got 58,000 C-suite executives around the world in our leadership database. So we're now in a position where we know a heck of a lot about leadership. And, we're in a position now where, with the new book coming out, we're going to be sharing that with the world.
Got it. So I guess my question is, when you're coming into work with an organization in the very beginning, right? Like I'm imagining a new client. Uh, you've gone through this process of collecting like the 3 years of data to then ascertain which metrics to or what the outcomes of those metrics are in terms of to identify strong leaders. Does that need to be like when you're working with a brand new company, is there an audit? Because I don't imagine all of them are utilizing the same metrics that you guys are measuring by. Um, so how do you do that in the sense of like, coming in and then doing an audit of where they are, and if they don't have those metrics in place, what are you doing to help assess them? Or does it need to have a certain amount of time to see how they perform under the metrics that you have defined, or is there a way to assess them still regardless?
Well, the process that Barry was describing was what we went through to build and validate
Yeah.
this assessment, right? So that tool has been built, and we've got about 58,000 leaders who continue to validate some of the insights that we've pulled from that. So going into a new client, that assessment and the model is actually already built. So then it's a process of figuring out what are the populations that we want to assess, because oftentimes companies are really poor at identifying who their high potential leaders are, or even the characteristics that exist within their current population of top performing leaders and how they position and develop those people. And Barry, you might have something to add. I saw you up there.
Well, I think the issue, we don't revalidate the tool with every client.
Got it.
When we look at all the validation studies we've done across lots of companies, the predictions hold true. If you get a high score on one of our assessments, you're going to be a better performer, period.
I see.
And therefore, when we engage with a new organization, that's what they want to buy. They want to buy that expertise because, they probably already know that the methods they use to select people aren't very good. And the evidence of that is they'll have too many people in their organization who have got into positions they shouldn't be in. I mean, I can't tell you the number of people, Chris, I've met who should not be anywhere near people, right? Never mind leading things. They shouldn't be anywhere near people. Yep. And these companies come to us and say, we need your help. We want you to come in and use your methodology to find the very best people, because we see a performance advantage by using your approach and your methodology. So we don't revalidate the tool with every client, but what we do, you use the point of conducting an audit. We try to figure out what they're currently doing.
Got it.
I have to tell you, companies do some weird and wonderful things when it comes to inflicting selection processes on unsuspecting job applicants. And, we try to take the nonsense out of their process. And there is a lot of that, a lot of stuff that people do, including Enneagrams. I'm not going to tell that story. But they do some crazy things. They do some things that they think work, but don't. And therefore, we spend a lot of our time in the early stages educating them around the things to stop doing, the things that they're doing that are good that we need to amplify, and then the things that we need to plug in that are just things that haven't crossed their mind right now.
Yeah. So my question here next would be coming around the idea of change, right? So one, I think a lot of times, when we've had these conversations with various experts and they're coming in consultatively or as a leader in that space, trying to inflict change in an organization, it's not even about like, it's not even about that playbook or their process or the platform itself. A lot of times it's like, how do you get the buy-in for change, right? A lot of times because it's going to be, especially senior leadership, are looking for direct outcomes, right? And in your case, you're essentially saying you're predicting the future of performance based on the assessments, based on data that you've created, right? So how do you get that initial buy-in? I guess like maybe from like even just thinking it from a very like tangible like business development perspective. Like I know you have 58,000 like C-suite executives. Is that kind of the network that you utilize to get the new business that you guys get, or is there like a learning curve to that? How do you pull case studies, or how do you make that that use case for working with them in the first place. And then I guess the second to that is like getting the willingness for change, because you need a buy-in from senior leadership, I'm sure, to buy into something that, you know, despite all of this information and all this data is in their mind still like not 100%, and they have to go in with faith, a certain amount of faith and confidence that you guys will deliver on that. And so how do you get over that hump? Because I think a lot of that times is mostly psychological, and it's not even like I could give you 100 case studies and have you call all of them up, and still there's still that like psychological hurdle to kind of overcome.
Well, I'll say a couple of things, then I'll hand over to Sarah. The first thing is we don't need to work with every company on the planet.
Yep.
And we pick and choose.
Okay.
And, you know, to your point, if we sense that the appetite for what we're doing isn't really true, we walk away.
There you go.
Because, you know, we don't need to create those kinds of difficulties and challenges. So that's the first point I'll make. The second point I'll make is that every single client is a referral.
Got it.
When you mentioned, do we utilize our database? We don't have to.
Yeah.
They do it for us. And that happens in a couple of ways. They'll either help us and make a call to somebody and say, you should work with these people. That's one way they help. In other ways, executives in one company will even go and join another, and they bring us with them.
Yep.
But what I would say to you is, we're not trying to sell this. We want people to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the fact that we're not trying to sell it means we don't have to work very hard at selling. We've never sold a darn thing in our life. People have bought from us. And therefore, when it comes to the points you were making about change management, if we don't have the top of the house asking us to come in, we don't even bother. Because as you know, if this can't be a low-level investment because of the expense of it, for one, it's not cheap. Yeah. And then the other thing is that we're talking about very sensitive issues, sometimes about who to keep and who to let go.
Yeah.
And therefore, people can become very defensive in those circumstances. I mean, if I just walked up to you and said, hey, I've got this assessment, Chris, I think you should spend 30 minutes doing it. And you're going, well, what, why, what's going on here? You need a rationale, you need to understand. So if we don't have the top of the house fully on board, probably wasting our time. So in every case, that will be a minimum expectation. Now, that doesn't make implementation easy, right? We've still got all the hard work ahead of us, but at least there is a strong will from the top that this is the direction we're going. Now, Sarah spends a ton of time with HR departments and HR folks, and I'll let her talk about the kind of conditions that she likes to see for us to be successful down there. But I just wanted to position the kind of concept of selling right so that you understand where we're coming from.
Yep, makes sense.
I mean, we definitely need the support from the leadership team who understands the value of holding out for the most talented candidates who are ultimately going to perform way better than the majority of the people that you could hire. So we need leadership holding a really strong line, because when you tell recruiters that most of the candidates that they service are not good enough, that we've got to slow the process down, that they've got to hold a really strong line with hiring managers and say, I know you like this one, but I think we could do even better. That's a really difficult kind of influencing game that we have to play. So you're right that we've got to be able to change people's minds and get them to rethink how they're doing things right now. And part of that is in slowing people's decision-making down, right? Before I've made up my mind about this candidate, before I fall in love with this single candidate, I've got to recognize that there might be others out there that are even better than they are. And I should be questioning all of the assumptions that are going into why I favor this person. So part of my job is just in slowing people down, getting them to look at more evidence than they might think they need to start questioning why they're preferring this candidate over anyone that they could see. And
Chris,
then we've all,
sorry.
Barry, yeah, carry on, Barry.
No, I was going to say, Chris, most companies ask the wrong question when they go through the process that Sarah's trying to slow down. The question they ask is, can this person do the job? That is a terrible question. I could drag 50 people off the street and probably find half a dozen who can do the job. Horrible question. Question they should be asking is this as good as I can get? And if they ask that question, it forces them to hold out for the very best candidate. And we can help them understand who that very best candidate is. Because right now, all they see, is a human being with a heartbeat and a smile, and they fall in love with candidates that they shouldn't fall in love with way too quickly.
Interesting. Interesting. Let's dive into that a little bit. We talked about, well, you alluded to this point of there's people that are in leadership positions that should not be dealing with people, period. And my question comes from, how do some of these people end up in leadership roles?
Okay. You got a tech startup, bunch of kids in a garage come up with a great idea. Before they know it, it's grown to 50 million. And these kids are having a ball. They're all tech geeks. They are phenomenal at what it is that they're building. I mean, I'm telling the story of Facebook, of course, right? And then they get a 50 million and they wake up and they suddenly realize I'm not having as much fun anymore. And why is that? I got all these people to manage. When I was doing the tech stuff, that was the exciting stuff. People are really hard. And anyway, my talents that equip me to be really good at the tech stuff don't necessarily translate to being great at managing people. Here's another example. You've probably heard many, many, many times that great salespeople don't necessarily make great sales managers.
Yep.
Why is that? Well, because to be a great salesperson, you've got to be sometimes a bit aggressive. You've got to be relationally sophisticated, but you've got to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Hardly the characteristics of sensitive management. Now, it's not that we don't want those characteristics in management. It's just we don't just want those characteristics in management. And quite often, those highly successful salespeople don't have those characteristics that make them to be a great sales manager. So the reason they get into the position is this. They realize that at some point in their career, if they want to earn more money or get more recognition or whatever, or have more influence, they've got to become a manager. And so great salespeople start applying for sales managers' jobs because that's what they think they have to do. And some of them are an unmitigated disaster, but a tiny number of them make it, and they're brilliant. So the answer to the question is, companies are often structured in a way that encourages people to do what's not in their best interests.
Yeah.
Now, I don't blame people for doing that. I mean, if you want to earn more money, more prestige, the rest of it, I get it. I'm with you. But there are different ways in which we should be doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of the times when I have spoken to other leaders in some of these fields, like you just talked about sales leaders or what have you, those that end up becoming leaders have to make a conscientious decision. And the ones that actually are doing well at it, I think that there's two key words that come up is like empathy and compassion. And being able to have those is, if you don't have it, figuring out how to learn about that, because like that's the number one thing. And there's this, I think it was maybe just like within the last week of sales leaders talked about, you go from being an individual contributor, which is primarily selfish, to being selfless as a leader. And because you're trying to help everybody else get to the best that they can individually, but also how does that contribute overall to a team environment? And so you're no longer just looking at yourself and what you're able to do, but how do you help everybody become the best at what they do? So it is definitely a very different skill set. Also, that said, I mean, I'm curious, like there are also industries where it is notorious, or at least historically notoriously different in terms of leadership styles. And I think about like specifically investment banking or like film studios and entertainment, like talent agencies and things like that, where it's a lot of it's been based on like a meritocracy. And then they get into these leadership roles, and they are not necessarily like the great people managers, but they got there because of what they are able to produce. And sometimes, you know, that's not conducive to managing teams. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like some of these industries that, you know, have a little bit more notoriety in terms of like the types of leaders that are promoted? And is there any thoughts around that? Does that work for those systems, do you feel like, or is there still rooms for improvement?
Well, well, I think to when I came over to the US from the UK in 2000 and was shocked to find there were more lawyers in the telephone directory than plumbers. In the UK, it's different. Now, the reason I mentioned that is that a lot of law firms have figured this out and they've appointed non-legal general managers to run the show because the lawyers all screw it up. Investment banking is another example. Private equity is another, where you've got these absolute hard-nosed achievers pushing, disastrous managers of people. You know, the characteristics that made them a successful investment banker, you know, when they're running a portfolio or got a team reporting to them, you know, they don't translate well into that kind of an environment. I'd pick out a few other luxury fashion. Particularly on the design side.
Makes sense. Yep.
I'll give you an example of a designer that I knew and worked with for a very short time. The reason why it was a short time will become apparent in a moment. But I worked with this designer for a very short time, and I asked him, how do you determine the successful season? So these fashion designers design by season, right?
Yeah.
So this is way beyond my expertise, but bear with me. He said, I don't need sales to know that I've done a good job. I just look at the quality of the product. And I said, what if nobody buys it? He said, I can't help if people have got uncouth tastes. Now, those kinds of leaders don't do well on our assessment because, you know, we believe that the value proposition around great leadership is fantastic performance. And these folks are so detached from the concept of performance. So I went to luxury fashion when you mentioned entertainment, because, you know, the other area where I would say it struggles is in, and this is going back a few years, but print media, papers.
Yep.
You know, the whole prima donnas around the certain news desks and things of that kind, and how dysfunctional those sorts of organizations were. And then the only other one that I would touch is the one I mentioned before, and that is pretty much most of tech. You know, the problem with tech is you got lots of brilliant people who, by definition, know it all. And because they know it all, then, you know, who are dumb nuts like Sarah and I to come along and say, hey, you might want to do this a little bit differently, because they know it all. So that's another area which isn't particularly receptive to this.
I'm listening to these examples and getting annoyed because there are certainly aspects of those leaders where they've got a kind of creative brilliance that makes them really valuable in certain, you know, in certain contexts. But you've got to recognize that there's a limitation to their ability to manage people or to get things done effectively with other people. And you think about the impact on the lives of all the people who report to them or have to deal with them.
Yeah.
And you say, why aren't we getting real about those limitations? Because we're damaging the lives of countless people in the process.
Yeah. I mean, I think that comes to like a lot of, I mean, we've talked about some of those industries are like, I like a lot of those creative industries, I feel like can be driven by ego, and to a certain degree, right? A lot of creatives, you know, to that point, I would say, yeah, I mean, they're doing something that's uniquely their vision, and that's powered by their ego, and that's what separates them to a certain point, I would obviously believe. But, you know, that's part of their brilliance, but also probably part of their demise. And that's why it's very hard to see sustained, you know, careers in some of these spaces, right? And then even in the finance industry, I think of, you know, us going through the crisis and you seeing like Lehman Brothers and those kinds of companies falling to the wayside. Like wondering if some of those things could have been prevented had there been a little bit, more of that humanity in the leadership roles versus what had powered them to get there in the first place, which is maybe some of that corporate greed or performance or outcomes, right? It's like at some point,
maybe a little integrity.
Yeah, right. So I mean, yeah, it's an interesting topic. I know we're wrapping up on time here, but I don't know if you guys have a hot take on I don't know if you guys watched the debate yesterday. I know I talked about it a little bit earlier, but just, we're talking about leadership and we have two candidates that are going to be a global leader, let alone, a leader for the United States in the fall term. And I don't know if you guys have any thoughts around just the state of it, around, how they come across to you or just any initial thoughts.
Politics is a different game, Chris, to business. I mean, in politics, the entire population gets to pick their leader. In business, that never happens. I'd rather stick to business. Thank you very much. The only thing I'd say from a leadership perspective is that I want our leaders setting the very best example for future generations. And that's how I look at leadership right now. So, you look at the debate and the question I ask is, who is setting the very best example? I'd even take it a stage further. I mean, my kids are well into their 30s now, but, who would I be comfortable sitting my kids in front of and listening? So I tend to look at politics through that lens. If you can't show up with a basic element of human decency where you tell the truth, you set a good example, you're open to your failings, right? You've got some humility. You don't think the world's out to get you. You believe that through effort and energy, you can make things happen yourself. That's the kind of leadership I'd like to see, because that's the kind of leadership I like to see in the organizations we work with.
And I would say that, I mean, even obviously politics and business is different, but there is influence that crosses between two, right? I mean, like politicians are a lot of times supported by business leaders, and vice versa, right? Like business leaders are able to forge out paths given political connections and things like that too. So while I agree, I think the games are played differently. There is definitely some correlation between the two. And I think there is influence, obviously, from our political leaders on how business leaders conduct themselves as well, right? I think there's bad actors that are business leaders that if they are given a political environment to take advantage of it, they'll take advantage of it. And then there's still those that, even given a more favorable environment, will stand on that integrity and not take advantage of it to that point.
We make a prediction on that very issue, Chris, with the assessment. Integrity in business leadership is absolutely key. Less so in the political arena. Yeah,
very, very, very much on point. Very cool. On that note, I want to say thank you guys so much for taking the time. I think it was really intriguing, very interesting conversation. I feel like we could probably go for like another few hours, but I think there's a lot of great nuggets in there. If people are more interested in terms of looking into your services as well as like your assessment and how to integrate that into their organizations, we'll be happy to share that as well.
I appreciate the time, Chris. Good talking to you.
Same.
Thank you, Chris. Take care.
Of course.